when there are multiple Gaussians that represent the data, we call this situation a mixture of Gaussians, or we call this probability density a mixture of Gaussians. Notice that if we have one single Gaussian, all we need to know is the mean and the variance, or covariance matrix. Think about all that I say in general in any dimensional situation, in any dimensional case. But if we have two Gaussian distributions, then in order for their sum of Gaussians with their respective mean and variance, if we have k of them or two of them, what we're actually doing, this will not be a probability distribution yet, but if we pre-multiply by a weight such that there's weight sum to 1, or as pi's, could be the priors, we could call them the priors, we can call them convex weights, basically a convex combination of Gaussians for a uniform probability of either left or right. We'll just scale them down by half, multiply by half each of them, and then sum, and we'll get a new distribution. This distribution is called Gaussian mixture model. What is its density? How does its density look, and how can we estimate it? So we have our data set and our parameter set, the likelihood of individual samples, and the overall likelihood because of the IID assumptions of our data set is just a product of individual likelihoods for each of the points. And so now we have an unobserved or latent parameter theta. And for all indices for all of the samples in the data set, we draw observation from the parametric distribution given theta. So theta is a parameter. Yeah, but if a single Gaussian doesn't feed the data, we use, as I said, mixture of Gaussians or modeling or mixture modeling or partitioning algorithms. Basically, we have a data set and we have a mixture of different models, and we partition our data set into a subset that belong to one model or another, are generated either one Gaussian or another one or the third one, and so on. It doesn't, in general, mixture modeling or partitioning algorithms don't have to be Gaussians, but Gaussians are fairly convenient to talk about and easier to deal with. So let's stick with Gaussians for now. And that allows us, in general, again, to if we want to estimate density, this is important. This is about density estimation still. Density estimation, recall, was very important for us by itself to figure out the probabilities of surrounding world, but then density estimation helped us to build a better classifier, like in the naive Bayes. And in general, density estimation is a useful way to model the world around us. So enough of that. Let's go a little deeper into mixture modeling. So instead of assigning everything to one class or one probability, just one Gaussian, let's consider this notion of soft assignment. So probability that sample xi belongs to the case cluster or to the case Gaussian. So we have two Gaussians. We have a sample here. Well, I should draw this color. So there is certain probability of all of these three samples to belong to each of the Gaussians, right? Or clusters, right? This sample has some probability of belonging to this group and has some probability of belonging to that group. And that probability is this weight factor by k. K clusters, k probabilities. As probabilities, they are positive and sum to 1. That is the convex combination that I mentioned before. And then probability of observing a certain point is just a sum of our posterior probabilities. It's probability, or actually the joint in this case, probability of observing x of a particular class. As you see, what's here is probability of observing x of a particular class integrated over or marginalized over all of the classes. This is probability of observing an x at some point. And again, classes is just the Gaussians. So if your density is your Gaussian distributions, mixture of Gaussians, then probability of observing a point here at this location is an integrand of what's the probability of this point according to orange cluster, what's the probability of this point according to what is it, magenta cluster and or purple, and according to the green cluster, their sum gives us probability of observing a point over here. That's what we have. So Gaussian mixture model. This is an example of three classes, mixture of k Gaussian distributions. The distribution will have multiple modes, k modes, ka heels protruding upward, so k components, and each component or the mode has an associated mean, and component k generates data from a Gaussian with respective mean and respective covariance. Mean is a vector and covariance is a matrix, so we kind of being general here for any distribution, any dimension where our data lives. And then each sample is generated as follows. Choose a component k with probability pi of k. So first we sample which component or which Gaussian we will be sampling from according to the probabilities of pi. And once we generated the sample, we generated the k, we know from which probability density, Gaussian probability density we will be sampling from, and so we do. One thing to note is that Gaussian mixture model is a generative model. Generative model is a class of models, or generative models is a class of models that don't only describe the data or don't only solve a problem of classification, say, but they can also generate the data that they were trained on, not just the data that they were trained on, the training data, but in general, the data that adhere to the distribution of the data that they were trained on. So for example, your kernel density estimators with Parson windows, and radial basis kernels. You can sample or generate new samples from those estimators once the estimation is done. And the same here in the Gaussian mixture models. For short, they are called GMMs. They're more readily recognized and known by this name, GMMs. GMMs are generative model, and here I'm describing a process of generating a sample from this model. First, with the prior probability sample, which Gaussian you will be sampling from, and then generate a sample from that Gaussian according to that Gaussian. Then do next the same, choose a probability distribution and sample, and continuing the process, you will see how your samples observe the characteristic of your multimodal mixture of Gaussians. So mixture of K-Gaussian distributions, our likelihood is now for a likelihood for the kth Gaussian is the Gaussian itself, and then we have a prior, and that's what we got the marginal for each of the point, which we already discussed. Gaussian mixture model can be thought of as clustering. So let's make some assumption. So if we assume for simplicity that our Gaussians all have the same covariance, there's no difference in covariance, it's all the same for them, and also this what's written here is the same variance for times identity matrix. That means all of those covariances are spherical. It's just around equidistant probabilities, equidistant in any direction. The only difference of those Gaussians is they have different means. The priors are the respective probabilities of sampling that covariance, multinomial distribution, and all of our parameters are known. The important is all of the means for each of the k Gaussians, the sigma squared variance, and the mixture probabilities or prior probabilities are also known. Then given x, we need to decide, does it belong to cluster K or cluster Z? Which cluster basically it belongs to. So, and we can do so, as you know, based on the posterior ratio and cluster K over cluster Z log. If we go and those are the posteriors, there's the Bayesian probability inversion formulas. Now the evidence cancels out. We know what we have here. Pi's are mixture component, proportion of this particular Gaussian in the overall sum, and then the normalizing constant cancel out, and what we get a question in your exam when you derive the decision boundary. You will see that it's linear. The decision boundaries for Gaussian mixture models are linear, and especially in the spherical case, those linear models are also pretty close, or actually the same, to the Voronoi tessellation of the space every point on this side of the decision boundary is closer to this mean, and every point on this side of those decision boundaries is closer to this mean. So they basically delineate the distance cells or regions of the space, or Voronoi cells, so called. This is R. Okay. So Gaussian mixture modeling, we have not talked about estimation. That's the topic of next lecture, not even this lecture. It's a very involved and interesting process. But as you may see already, just by this in the forward mode, in the generative mode, Gaussian mixture model resembles grouping the data around those respective means. The data either belongs to one mean, one Gaussian, one group, or another mean, another Gaussian, another group.